So Michael, why don't we start at just start at the beginning what we were talking about. Just what, growing up for you, what were your impressions of the military in general, and what were those impressions based on?
Well, I was born in 1950 in the middle of the United States of America, just a few years after the end of World War II. In fact, I was born within days of the beginning of the Korean War. And of course, being the beginning of the TV generation also, I always saw, I guess, almost propaganda or nationalistic history and movies supporting the U.S. Army, and I grew up embracing that as my mythic heroes, and I had that sort of attitude, and probably until I started to graduate from high school and realized that if I didn't go straight into university, I was going to be going straight to Vietnam. And that sort of colored my opinion about the military for almost a 4-year period while I went to university. And the semester before I graduated, due to some bureaucratic maneuvers in my local draft board, I was able to fulfill my obligation to the draft, and they did not require me or need me. And so I duly graduated, gave up any thoughts or worries or kind of consideration about the United States, although I was still very, very involved with following the media about Vietnam, because it had been a daily news story as long as I could remember. By that time, 7 or 8 or 9 years, going back even to pre-war period in Vietnam. And it was still really, really a concerning issue to me. In fact, I'd even made one of those treks to Washington, D.C., sort of a war protest movement at one time. But in 1973, I was on a post-university vacation trip to Europe, and in Switzerland I met a young Canadian woman who's from a ranching family here in southern Alberta near Nanton, and we fell in love, spent a year together in Europe, and I came back to Alberta with her in the spring of 1974, and I've been here ever since. I've really embraced the Alberta way of life, enjoyed it, and those were sort of the military thoughts I had up to that period. The family I married into were multi-generation ranchers here, had no military involvement, and it just, the forces really wasn't an issue in our life.
Would you say that, was it, you said you embraced that kind of military, sort of a Hollywood perhaps version of the U.S. military in the 50s when you were a boy growing up, but then when you were in the chute and could potentially go to Vietnam, do you think you became anti-military at that time? Would you go that far?
I don't think I would say I was anti-military. I think I was anti-political involvement of it. And I certainly realized that I was very frightened about the concept of going to Vietnam, but even more so, I think I was more challenged by the American image of boot camp. What really frightened me was having to be locked up with a bunch of people I didn't really know and being put put through extreme physical challenges that I just didn't feel mentally, emotionally capable of at the time. I think actually boot camp to me seemed like the greater dread and fear. Going to Vietnam with my education and schooling, I probably could have gotten to all kinds of other positions besides front range jobs. So it was more boot camp that frightened me. So I really wasn't anti-military, no.
So just one final question, but just looking back at that time, had your number come up that you were going to be drafted, what was your intent or what was your plan?
Well, my number did come up. I was, when we went to a lottery system in the United States, I had a very, very low number drawn, almost in the bottom 10% in terms of going right forward. But I guess I had thought of various options and really discarded them. I had known one fellow that I went to high school with that did go to Canada, but I didn't know anybody in Canada, and I was used to my home and my extended family and friends and community, many of whom I'm still in touch with right now. I do have a very large family still in the United States. My father's still alive. I'm the oldest of 6 children. They're all my siblings are still alive, my nieces and nephews. I go back and forth to the United States. I never was going to abandon the United States under any kind of negative circumstances. But meeting a beautiful young Canadian woman who wanted to be in love with me gave a whole different option and twist to going to Canada.
So if it had come down to it, you were prepared to go to Vietnam?
Oh, well, I was prepared to go into the Army. There were other options too. I had one of my really good friends from grade school and high school. He dropped out of college. It just wasn't the college life for him. And he volunteered for the forces, and because he volunteered, he was in for 3 years, as opposed to being drafted to go to Vietnam. You were usually in for 2 years. You did 6 months basic training, you did a 1-year tour, and you generally got out after 18 months. He was in for a full 3 years, but he was stationed in Germany. So he did not really, and he got a job working as an office job in some kind of manner in Germany. So it wasn't terribly onerous, other than the fact that he was in the Army. No one was shooting at him, that's for sure. So I've been speaking as if Vietnam was the only option, but the United States is an extremely large bureaucracy and operation. They didn't have their whole army in Vietnam by any stretch of the imagination.
So let's, are you okay with me just asking you questions?
Oh, yeah, you can do it, yeah.
Okay. So let's flash forward then. Now Nathan's on the scene. What kind of, I don't know, just what kind of young man was he prior to joining the military?
Well, he was a very sensitive young guy. He was always in, fairness was a big consideration to him. He went to the Calgary Waldorf School, very alternative sort of private school. He was a good student, he was a good friend. We were very involved as a family with that community and lifestyle. He had friends that he'd been around all his life. He was a very, very good athlete. When he played on so many different sports at the Calgary Waldorf School, he was selected as Calgary's Junior High School Athlete of the Year after grade 9. Very, very athletic. And we were both very interested in sports. I took him to the Flames games, the Calgary Stampeders games. The Dinos were our favorite team. We went to watch all the Dinos hockey and football, basketball, all that sort of thing. We were great friends. He was really interested in sports, and he followed his big sister's footsteps into going to Bishop Carroll High School, which has quite an alternative scheduling sort of regimen, more or less almost like a university type of situation. But he was not quite as driven and disciplined as she was. He enjoyed sports at Bishop Carroll, but he did not enjoy getting up and going to classes early in the morning. So once again, going back to some of my previous statements, we weren't much of a military family. We read politics, we read history, we knew about the situations that were going on around the world, but we really did not have any strong relationships within members of the Canadian Forces or with our extended family in the United States in the U.S. military. But Nathan began talking with a very good family friend who was in the King's Own Calgary Regiment, reservist, and he began telling Nathan about the part-time job opportunities and just some of the things that the King's Own Calgary Regiment were able to do. Nathan came down, found out some of the background information about that while he was 17, and the week after his 18th birthday, he surprised our entire family and made the first independent decision of his adult life while he still had a year of high school to go. And he joined the King's Own Calgary Regiment in June 2001. Looking back, that was one of the worst times to decide to become a soldier. Sort of like volunteering at 18 to go to Vietnam. Because in September of 2001, there were the attacks in New York City on 9/11, and Nathan hadn't started school that morning, and he came running upstairs. His sister and I were in the house. His mom was away on a trip that time, and the three of us watched all the events of 9/11 unfold right before us. And having my American background, I just was very, very distraught. Of course, at first I was upset by the potential for a large loss of life, but I also knew in the hours and days following that the United States was going to be very, very, very mad, and there was going to be some big payback sometime. And I had a terrible premonition that it was going to be something bad for our family, and all this eventually came down the road years later on a battlefield in Afghanistan. So I began to feel that particular energy right there. Even though Nathan was still in high school, he was still on the football team, he was still doing King's Own Calgary Regiment Reserve as a part-time job, but it was always back there that he wanted to do a mission And as the news began to unfold on a regular basis, I followed it right along every day with the Canadian Forces' involvement in Afghanistan, some of the terrible early tragedies with accidental deaths, then battlefield deaths. It was all something that our family all really felt for an extended period of time. It was sort of going back to the 1960s and having something like Vietnam always being around 24/7. With same sort of energy about Afghanistan for a number of years before Nathan decided to go on his mission.
At the time you were watching 9/11, did you share this premonition with Nathan or the others in your family?
I shared it with my wife and some very close friends about 1 and 2 months after 9/11, yes. Really didn't talk to Nathan about it, no. I talked to my adult friends, yeah.
What was Nathan's reaction to the 9/11 coverage?
Oh, he was very upset. We were very stressed out. Of course, as you might recall, if you were looking at the first few moments of it live when those towers, the commentators were saying that 50,000 people worked in those buildings. So of course, the first fear when they come up with a big number like that is that there's 50,000 people going to die there. I mean, that's just horrendous number. You're talking about almost like Hiroshima or Nagasaki type of numbers. It was terrible enough for over 3,000 people to lose their lives there, but 50,000 was just a number that was almost incredible to talk about. And being with my daughter and son to witness that alone, it was just, it was a very stressful for all three of us. We just shared a lot of I'm not articulating this very well, but a lot of very upset energy between us. And my daughter and my son, because of my American citizenship, are also Americans, dual citizens. So we just felt the real empathy.
How did you see as the years progressed from there? He enrolls in, around that time. How did you see him changing through his involvement with the military before he went to Afghanistan?
Well, he became, he grew up between 18 and 24, of course. He grew up from a big boy into a young man. He had a number of other jobs. He finished high school. He went to what was then Mount Royal College. He took the 2-year program and did extremely well at that. I was to learn after his death from some of his professors that they had found him the best student they'd ever had. He was very interested in politics, in world history, in maps. I have an extensive library in my house. Nathan and I used to pore over all kinds of maps. He could name just about every country in the world. We just had a sense of a world community. And he changed into the type of young man, and he wrote about this himself, who thought that a big, strong guy like him, with every kind of opportunity there is, no matter how dangerous it was, someone like him should be willing to put his life on the line to defend those who couldn't. And that was the sort of attitude he took with him when he volunteered for his mission, and which he had always, I think, when he was engaged with the Canadian Forces.
Do you want to just stop? For a
No,
second?
I'm fine.
Do you want there's water whenever you
No,
need?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Maybe it's me that I'm worried about.
Yeah. We have Nathan's diaries when he articulated this. We have his comments to the media before he left, because it was a news story that 4 reservists were going over to Afghanistan. They'd all volunteered out of the King's Own Calgary Regiment, and went to joined up with the Lord Strathcona's horse. Nathan had been asked to be the first Canadian reservist since the Korean War to operate a main battle tank. He was trained to operate the Leopard tanks, which were just being deployed to Afghanistan to provide a little bit more firepower in the confrontation with the Taliban insurgents.
Tell me, like you told me off camera, about the day that you and Nathan talked about this decision about do I go or don't I go? How did that come about?
Well, Nathan had moved out of the family home and called me up one night about, oh, I don't know, 10 or 10:30, a work night, and he told me that he had had an opportunity to volunteer to train on these Leopard tanks and then to go to Afghanistan. We had talked before that about him perhaps going on a mission somewhere, but we had never directly spoken about going on a mission to Afghanistan. When he asked me what I thought about that opportunity, I certainly didn't want to make any decision for him, and I didn't want to prejudice it one way or the other. And so I just tried to say, well, why don't you do what I'd like to do in my perfect world if I could, and that would be to take this kind of decision-making process into my dream space. Why don't you sleep on it one night? He said, okay. But he called me back in about 10 or 15 minutes, and in the interim few minutes, he talked to another member of his regiment, and they said, hey, this is an incredible opportunity. If you don't take it quickly, they're just going to go down the line and ask somebody else. And so he called back to his sergeant and said, yes, he would go on this mission, and that was that. And just like when he had joined the KOCR, at this time over 5 years before that, our family was right behind him. We didn't have anything ever negative to say about his decision. We'd never said, well, at least I never personally said anything negative about Canada's decision to deploy Canadian forces to Afghanistan. Myself, I thought that if we were going to be members of a treaty such as NATO, that we had to follow the rules of the law and of the treaty. One of the treaty members had been attacked, and so I was comfortable with that, and it was also a United Nations mission, and so I had no political grievances with the forces being deployed there, and I thought naively, in hindsight, that the Canadian forces were a little bit more secure than they were, and that being in operating a Leopard tank, Nathan would be even more secure there. I really could not visualize properly what a forward operating base was like, and how often the Canadian forces were involved in engaging with the Taliban.
And yet you said earlier you'd had this very personal premonition on 9/11. Did that come into play after Nathan told you what he wanted to do?
No, I think those thoughts came up for me several times. I won't say a number of times, I'll say at least several times, and I refused to even engage them. As a father, I was not going to envision anything that involved harm to my son. Perhaps it was superstition, something as ephemeral as that. I just simply did not want to think any kind of bad thought about my son. I just wanted to send him all the good, loving energy I could. I never wanted him to worry about me, and I think if I began articulating worries about him, I would distract him from his task at hand. I wanted him to stay as absolutely focused as he could, and that would be the best way possible to ensure that he would come back all right.
Did you have some kind of a family send-off for Nathan, like before he went overseas?
Yeah, the family has a ranch up in the Porcupine Hills west of Manton, and this property actually now belongs to my daughter. Her mother has passed away after Nathan lost his life. She died of breast cancer 2.5 years ago, and up there on this property there was an extended family party. They decided to have an early Thanksgiving for Nathan send-off, and that was in August of 2007. In fact, this morning I just happened, not intentionally, but I opened up a folder, said Nathan, and I saw briefly it was photocopies of his diary from his trip, and he took off on August 28th, 2007. Flew from here to Valcartier, and today's August 30th, so it was 9 years and 2 days ago.
Can you tell me what kind of contact once Nathan got over there, what kind of contact did you have with him, and what did he convey to you about his job or his impressions, if he's happy, concerned?
Yeah. From the beginning of his training process, which involved going to, oh boy, I'm having my senior moment, the large base in New Brunswick, Gagetown. He went to Gagetown and trained. He trained on the American base just outside of El Paso. Do you recall the name of that base? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
He said it was like being on the moon or Mars or something like that in the desert, training there. But he liked training with the Americans. He liked training with the fellows he left Calgary with. Then they went over to Germany to train with the manufacturers about the equipment. he was based out of Edmonton at this time, of course, with the regular force members of the Lord Strathcona Horse, and he became really, really good friends with these guys. He just thought they were the best people in the world to be with, to be around. He was like the kid in the regiment, and he always spoke so highly and favorably about his fellow soldiers. When he got to Afghanistan, he phoned me when he had time and the opportunity to, and it was as clear as if he was at his condo here in Calgary calling me up to talk to me. And the last phone call we had was for about a half an hour. Once again, because of the 12-hour time difference, I was in my bed reading before I went to sleep, and he was just finishing up his coffee over in Afghanistan, and we talked for about a half an hour, and then the phone cut out, and he called me right back because he didn't want me to be worried. There'd just been some kind of technical problem, and he said he was going to have to head off because some truck had come in and he was going to have to unload the equipment using his tank. And we closed our phone conversation. I said, "I love you, son." And he said, "I love you too, Dad." And that was on a Sunday night. And I went to work on Monday, and I had a meeting after work, so I didn't come home at the regular time. And it's a beautiful, beautiful day, as you can only have here in the fall in Calgary. September 24th was a Monday evening, and I came home and I was going to have a glass of wine. And I was facing my counter in my kitchen. I had the wine there, and my doorbell rang. Now that's not that unusual in suburbia, but for whatever reason, for a moment, maybe that premonition came all back. I did not want to go to the door. But of course I did. And I opened the door, and there were 3 dress uniform Canadian Forces officers there, and I knew in an instant. And I talked to my son just, not even 24 hours before that. And then he was gone forever. And a glass of wine sat untasted on my counter for days until I headed to Toronto to be driven out to the airport base and escort Nathan back. Nathan was the 71st soldier to lose his life in Afghanistan, and he was the first one to come down the Highway of Heroes after they put up the signs designating it as such. And due to the circumstances, we were going back into Toronto on Friday at about 4:30, rush hour. Of course, the highway was shut down our way, and there was so much traffic coming out of Toronto, and people stopped their vehicles, and they got up and lined up by the barriers and everything. It was an incredible display. Very, very classy. it changed a whole lot of my Albertan views about Ontario people. Really did. It was very powerful. And coming back here to Calgary, I was allowed to be on the runway when Nathan's coffin was brought here too, and lined up there with the soldiers, policemen, and it's very, very powerful. And one part of that process, I felt the hand on my shoulder, and I turned around, and there was a friend of mine who was a baggage carrier, worked for Air Canada, and he'd used his day off to come back down there and be there just to support me. And when I turned around, I saw in the windows of the airport were just filled up with people standing there too. I get that same memory every time I go to the Calgary airport and I walk down that hallways. I remember all those people looking out and supporting us. When I got here to Calgary, of course, there was a parade down to the funeral home. Incredible visitation. The city was so classy, they gave us the Roundup Center for Nathan's funeral. The parade down there was just, it was just so inspiring. All those people in the Roundup Center too. It's a classy place we live in. Really, really good. And to this day, I've never heard a bad word about Canadian forces from anybody I know or I'm around. In order to help with my son's legacy and the men he served with, I always attend every kind of ceremony I can. I speak with the media, I speak in schools, I speak wherever to promote the legacy and the actions of the Canadian forces in all times, all places, and I'm just really so proud that my son served in that type of organization with those kind of people. The soldiers he served with, they come down on the anniversary of his death every year to Nanton and they help out on the ranch. They've just been remarkable people. Even after they've retired, they fly in from all over the country to be there. And they also, because of the way Nathan was engaged in his last battle, the members of EME proposed that Nathan be made an honorary member, and this was accepted. And they, at their national convention one year, was in actually in October of 2008. Linda and I were flown out to Kelowna, and Nathan became the first soldier in Canadian Forces history to be made an honorary member of REME and EME. I'm really, really proud of that. And we were allowed a next of kin visit to Afghanistan in October of 2009, and right there on the EME base at Kandahar Airfield is Hornburg's Corner, big sign that now hangs at the base there in Edmonton.
Can we go back just a bit?
Sure.
And talk about, just for the benefit of people that don't know the story, what happened that day that Nathan died? What, as you were told later, what was he doing? What was the situation, and what was he doing?
No,
when he was
okay. Nathan was on an operation, began early on September 24th. And of course, I can't recall the Afghan name of it. In English, it was called Operation Honest Soldier. And they were going to reopen a police outpost in a remote place that had been abandoned or overrun, something like this. Something that in our community we just take for granted, that you could have policing. But the Canadian forces were going to be deployed out in two different streams. One was going to be more of a decoy, and the other one was going to go to the abandoned police force. They headed out about 4 in the morning, apparently, something like this, and Nathan was part of the decoy force, and they began coming under small arms fire about 15 minutes out of the base. And Nathan and a number of other soldiers were operating Leopard tanks. You have to realize either people are very skilled or very desperate to be attacking Leopard tanks with small arms fire. And of course they had LAVs with them too, they had infantry. And they proceeded out for several hours along the Argendab River Valley. The water is very, very low at that time, and so there was a very rocky, sandy bed, and they got to the point where they were supposed to stop and kind of make their stand. And across the river from them was a small village, and one of the tanks, in turning around, maneuvering, it lost its track, pardon me. Nathan went out on every mission. He drove what is called the ARV, is the acronym. It's an Armored Recovery Vehicle. It's a Leopard tank that instead of a cannon on the front, it has a crane. So Nathan came to, apparently already on this mission, he'd pulled some of the LAVs out of ditches, that sort of situations. So he went to pull the Leopard tank into a position where they could break down the track and to get it back on there. And while he was doing this, the track came off of his armored recovery vehicle. And so they had two tanks in a position where they were immobile. The rest of the tanks got around them and the LAVs in what they called their ring of iron, and they were taking in incoming fire from 3 different positions: RPGs, machine gun fire, whatever. It was an extremely large force of insurgents attacking them. And Nathan worked outside because that was his job to reestablish these, with a small group of people, to reestablish these tracks. And they got the track back on his vehicle after several hours of work under fire. And then they had the track laid out on the other tank. And the commanding officer was aware through intercepted communications that the Taliban, if they were Taliban, they could have even been Chechens or whoever, I'm not sure myself, but they were deploying a Russian-made anti-tank shoulder-fired weaponry. And Nathan had gotten back in his tank. He was by himself. He was hooked up to pull the other tank into position, and a shot came in, And I think the first one hit close to their base from about 600 meters out, and the second one struck the front of Nathan's tank, and his tank just backed up a very short distance and bumped into another tank and stopped. And some of the soldiers who were standing around outside, they were injured with shrapnel, and the commanding officer asked the medic to first go in and check on Nathan and then come out and help with the soldiers who were wounded outside. And the medic just was in for a moment and came back out and started dealing with the other guys, and his CO yelled and screamed at him. He says, "What are you doing?" "I told you to check on Nathan." And he said, "He's gone." So apparently, against all odds, they put extra armament on the outside of the tanks in situations like that to deflect rocket-propelled grenades and things like this. And this shot had come in at a crazy angle on the front of the tank, and it sheared off one of the bolts that attaches this type of equipment, and the bolt came through and hit Nathan in the heart. He died instantly from a single wound. And so the Canadian forces had to call in the American Air Force to transport Nathan and the wounded. Of course, they were, by flying time, so close to CAF. They brought in, I'm sorry about the designation, F-18, F-16, the fighter jets they had. They came in and dropped some extremely large bombs on where the shots have been coming from, and they brought in their Apaches and Black Hawks, and of course the Canadian forces and their tanks, as soon as they realized that they were being attacked by this martyr, they began firing. So the whole battle just escalated very, very quickly, but it escalated too late for Nathan. But after a number more hours, the situation was stabilized. They were able to, the other part of the Canadian forces situation, they were able to reestablish the police station, and then they went back to their forward operating base, Massamgar.
So was it a mortar or a rocket-propelled grenade?
No, it was a mortar, one of those 81 or 82 millimeter anti-tank weapons, Russian-made.
Or a recoilless rifle?
Recoilless rifle, yeah.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Yeah. 'Cause
They call them a mortar. That's what it's. I've always seen it called as a mortar, but it's a shoulder-fired recoilless sort of thing. 81, 82 millimeter. It's designated.
Yeah. Or often they would have a tripod if it's a recoilless rifle because it's so heavy.
Yeah.
But,
I'm not sure.
yeah, I know. I'm asking because I heard. I think at the time there was a little bit of confusion, was there not, about what?
There was certainly confusion in my mind when I was first told about this, because in my citizens naive type of thing, when I heard Nathan was killed by a martyr, I had an image of him just being blown up by some kind of cannon. But I have mentioned this discrepancy to other soldiers subsequent to that, and they've said, well, that is a martyr, this shoulder-fired sort of situation. And if you look by category of how our losses have been suffered in Afghanistan, the deaths, there's one listed as by martyr, and that's Nathan.
To be honest, I don't really know what to ask you about that period from your notification and onwards. Like, are there other impressions? You mentioned the people that you saw at the airport. Are there other impressions that come back to you, and are there other aspects that you don't remember, perhaps?
Yeah, there are an incredible amount of images at Trenton going there. The pilot, when we landed in Toronto, going out there, he mentioned who we were and why we were there, and everybody remained seated on the airplane, and we got off first. And when we went to Trenton, of course, I met General Hillier for the first time, and the Governor General was there, Michael Jean, and she hugged me and talked to me, and I had the impression at that time that I was in the presence of someone like Mahatma Gandhi on that kind of situation. I just felt so much incredible empathy and sympathy and grace out of her. She was exactly the right person at that moment. It was very powerful, and I'll always have that memory too. And that began the process. It's continued this day of me meeting so many people that I never would have met, and they're all through Nathan's legacy. And every time these moments come, I take a bit of a pause internally, and I say, thank you, son. This is another gift from you. Nathan's means gift in Hebrew, and he was born on Father's Day. And he's given me so many gifts. He's with me all the time. It's been really powerful. This is completely different, I believe, than past sort of situations. Earlier, I was talking about Vietnam. Very, very different way soldiers were brought back to the United States at that time. Perhaps it was just simply because there were such a volume, but also because the war was unpopular with a huge parts of the American population. I never sensed that in Canada, and of course we had relatively smaller numbers. Every loss was taken so personally by our entire community, and I have met politicians of all stripes, civic people, just so many people in situations. They'll recognize me now from various public events I've been at or spoken at, and they'll begin telling me about their losses in other ways, not simply in the Canadian Forces. And it's been very powerful to sense that grief is such an incredibly human connector in the world. I'm really humbled by that, and I wish I could be a better person to recall this all the time too, to be kinder, braver, nicer to people. I do see the Canadian Forces as representing that around the world. Perhaps we make mistakes because we forget too, even as members of the Canadian Forces family. But largely, we're trying to represent what is all best about being human.
It sounds like you're grateful under those very difficult circumstances for the way that the Canadian Forces members handled it, from the time you were notified, and then, as you said, the soldiers that come back to the ranch every year.
I personally have been able to use a phrase over and over again. I've been very, very fortunate in my misfortune. The Canadian Forces have embraced me wholeheartedly, and they've said it too, and they've acted it, that I am a member of the Canadian Forces family, full-fledged. And that is an incredible privilege, I believe. And I say once again, I'm humbled by that. I never expected to be in the Canadian Forces. I never thought I was brave enough. I never thought I could undergo the type of discipline that people who serve do. But if anybody ever asked me to speak for or about or to the Canadian Forces, I will do it as long as I'm physically capable of doing so. So yes, I'm very, very touched by that opportunity.
When in the process did you start thinking about what Nathan's legacy could be, how you could, use his death for something positive?
Well, I guess there was two initial things that come quickly to mind. I was made aware of Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan within just a few weeks after the loss of Nathan. And they invited me to a dinner with some Afghan people there. And then they asked me to speak. And I'd never spoken publicly before. And I had no idea that I could talk in front of other people about something so emotional. And I looked out and I was talking and everybody else was weeping. They were getting it. And that let me know that I could overcome one of my big fears and become a public speaker. And then a short time after that, I, through a very dear family friend, she was working with the running room, and we came up with an idea of organizing a run in Nathan's name. Nathan, from the time going back to, as I was saying, when he was in grade school at the Calgary Waldorf School, he'd done some incredibly heroic cross-country runs I accompanied him with. His mother had started a series of races at the Calgary Waldorf School, and both his mother and I were longtime runners and racers, and so that fell naturally into that, and we finally came up with the name Loops for the Troops, and we held the first one on Father's Day 2008 on the Farmer Curry Barracks there, and then we moved it to North Glenmore Park. So that was, I guess, the most sort of I don't know if the word's prominent, but the kind of largest public thing I did to sort of support the Canadian Forces and Nathan's legacy.
But it didn't happen this year, right? Is it now done? Has it run its course, do you think?
Well, I must admit that emotionally, I was a bit tired of the responsibility for it now, and it's given me the energy and impetus to do some other things without this kind of being part of my responsibility. But I have had some preliminary talks with people recently, and 41 Brigade is interested in maybe taking over the management of it. And I'd be more than happy if they want to do that. They can have the name and the responsibility, and if they need me to show up on the day of and either participate or help or speak to the media, I will of course do that. But I just don't think after 8 years I wanted to be the one that called 1,000 of my best friends together and had them standing out in a cold, freezing downpour one year or something like that.
Well, you talked a lot about, you and your reaction, obviously. I mean, this is your story and Nathan's story. What about the effect of Nathan's death on his sister, his mother? How did it affect your family in that regard?
I've never heard anybody say one negative word, other when I told my daughter over the phone about this and heard her screaming and crying. We've never been that type of person or families since then. Linda, Nathan's mother, spoke at schools and public events. My daughter, she attends, she has a Silver Cross also, and we represent as best we can. We talk about Nathan all the time to Rachel's 2 children who've never met him, who are now 8 and 6. And so we talk about Uncle Nathan all the time in a very positive way. We're people who go forward. But I am saddened, and I think it could have contributed in some way. Nathan's mother discovered 6 months after he died that she had breast cancer. And she was the type of person who didn't drink, didn't smoke, did the yoga, meditated. Her parents both lived to be 90 years old, that sort of thing. I would have never thought that this would happen, and she went through a first round of the treatment, and it came back several years later. It had metastasized, and she passed away at the age of 67. She had many, many more years to live. So I just think perhaps grief had a lot to do with that, but of course I can't know, or shouldn't perhaps even speculate, but something caused it.
I was apprehensive about this interview, just asking you questions about it, because it's such an emotional topic. And yet you put yourself out there, and through the tears and the emotion. Why is it so important?
Well, I think it's hard because this is all part of being human. And as I mentioned earlier, so many people have come up to me. I'll go to, say, renew a license or do something at a bank or anywhere, or in a grocery store. And the teller or the clerk, they'll look at me and they say, "I know you. I saw you on TV. I know who you are." And then they'll tell me some small vignette about their story of loss, about something else. Or they might share that they're an Army or a Navy or an Air Force brat, or something about their family. And I'm touched by that. Those are important stories, and I think I mentioned earlier that I came from an American family that were very literate. We got, in the 50s, in addition to watching TV, we had all kinds of weekly magazines and daily newspapers, and I can pick up any kind of literature to this day and hear about all kinds of disasters. People become numbers, they're just dying, they're just, to bring one person's death out just personalizes myself and other people, I believe. And I think that's important. I think that's why I do it. One of the reasons. And I'm not embarrassed by my tears or my emotions or anything else. I think I'm human.
That's what it says in your business card.
Yeah.
Right?
Part of it. I'm a conservative earthling. I'm a parent, author, and artist. Or writer. I didn't say art. Writer.
How concerned are you that with the passage of time, Nathan's story will be forgotten or diminished in some way? Does that concern you in sort of the larger picture?
No, I don't think it does. I think that's the nature of humanity too. I'm going back in my memory and telling the stories today. Perhaps a year ago, I told it a different way. Perhaps a year in the future, I'll tell it differently too. Every time I'm trying to tell the truth, the story is as accurately as it is, but I probably change it too. My emotions about it change too, so I can't be concerned about myself losing touch with this, or other people either. I think that's why Canadian forces have given us this opportunity. It's not a trite saying. There's Canadian Forces members in harm's way all over right now, and there's consideration of sending more into even perhaps more dangerous places in the future. And if I'm ever asked to stand up and speak for them, I'll do that also. It's never been for me simply just about Nathan. It's always been about the best and bravest in our society that have allowed me to have such a life of privilege, and I know too often I forget that I have this privilege, and then it becomes a sense of entitlement to me, and I don't want to just be an entitled person. I want to be able to do what is best for the whole planet and all the people on it if I can.
So with that in mind, what do you want people, when you speak or when you talk to me today, what's the one main thing that you want people to take away from Nathan's example and his story?
In one word, peace. I close every talk with saying peace, and when I write emails or notes to people, I say peace. I think in order to work together to make a better place to live, the most important ingredient to me is peace, and that's what I hope Nathan's legacy helps to inspire in as many people as possible. That he lost his life in the midst of a big battle when he was a soldier, and he was perhaps the least armed person there. He drove a great big tank that didn't even have a cannon on the front of it. It had a crane on it. He was out working without a weapon or anything. He wasn't out there trying to engage anybody in any kind of negative way. And so I think my son is a real hero to embody the concept of peace. When there's danger all around, where there's a job to be done, just do it anyway, because it's all part of becoming part of the concept of peace. Very proud of him.
It sounds like you had a very strong relationship.
We did. We had an incredible relationship, yeah. It was not trivial by any stretch of the imagination.
Is there anything I haven't asked you today that you want to finish on by saying? Anything that you think we've neglected or you want to?
No, not that I can recall. I might keep us talking here forever if I could go that. No, I'm good with it. You've got a lot to edit to get me down to 30 seconds.
Thanks very much.
You're more than welcome.